And let's move over to this story. The sentencing of 4 journalists in Burundi has reignited the debate on media freedom on the continent. The journalists were sentenced to 2.5 years in jail for trying to undermine state security. The reporters were arrested in October while covering a rebel attack. Critics say the imprisonment is part of Nkurunziza's regime and tendency to suppress information that could threaten its interests. But there aren't only ones. Journalist Samuel Wazizi from Cameroon has been missing for 5 months, while at least 7 others have been in prison since December, and the list goes on and on and on. Right now, I'm joined by the chairperson of the African Editors Forum, Jovial Rantau, who joins us now in studio. Good evening and welcome to the Field View. Did it come as a surprise at all, this judgment that was handed down by the courts in Burundi?
Well, thanks for having us. It didn't come as a surprise. Certainly it's a shock. It didn't come as a surprise because the African Editors Forum has been concerned for quite a while about the situation in Burundi. You know, Burundi ranks amongst the worst countries on the African continent when it comes to media freedom. As we speak now, more Burundian journalists operate outside the country because of the oppression and suppression that they face from the government of Pierre Nkurunziza. You know, and the big problem we have in Burundi, like we do in many countries, is that these journalists were arrested simply for doing their job. You know, they were on their way somewhere. They came across a protest and they did what journalists do. They stopped and they started interviewing people. Yeah. And for that, the law enforcement agencies picked them up and they very violently, you know, the female member of the crew was assaulted quite badly, and they were thrown into detention for a couple of months, and nobody knew where they were. Families didn't know, and then they were charged, you know, and received these hefty sentences, which we strongly condemn as TAIF, and we call on the African Union to do something about this.
What is that call on the African Union? Because if you think about what happened with Pierre Nkurunziza just a couple of years before the elections took place, and that whole argument around the second term, third term, or whatever term that he was in, and the Constitutional Court at that time in Burundi took a decision and said that no, President Pierre Nkurunziza is allowed to continue his tenure. Some argued that he had influenced the court, and this matter was then taken to the African Union, and not much happened after that. So what difference do you think really the African Union could make with this call that you're making now?
Well, there's the question you're raising quite correctly is a political question that the African editors cannot answer. You know, but what we do want to do and what we'll continue to do is to lobby and put pressure on African leaders to do something about media freedom. African leaders are signatories to the Windhoek Declaration, the Table Mountain Declaration, and many others, and in which they pledge to uphold media freedom, in which they pledge not to act against voices that they do not agree with. But what you see on a daily basis, you know, it's not only Burundi that we concerned with. Burundi is the latest case that we were worried about. But we continue to be worried about countries like Nigeria, for instance, where a colleague was shot dead just a week ago. We continue to be worried about Cameroon.
And the Gambia.
And the Gambia is a big worry. The Gambia, for us, it's almost like Tanzania. You'll remember that a few years ago, the Gambia was on the verge of a new dawn, if you borrow a South African phrase, you know? Adama Barrow came in as his new broom, sweeping clean after Yahya Jammeh went into exile, you know, and all legislation that was inimical to media freedom was removed. And now what we are faced with is a reversal that we all are also experiencing in Tanzania under the presidency of John Magufuli.
South Africa, of course, assuming chairmanship of the African Union this month. What call is it that you're making to the African Union chairperson, who's also the president of South Africa and the president of the ANC, which has said that it respects and will continue to uphold the freedoms that are enjoined by the Constitution for journalists to ensure that they do what they're supposed to do?
Well, South Africa, for us, is amongst those countries on the African continent that uphold media freedom. And we want to work with those countries, those presidents, to use their offices through the AU and bilaterally to influence leaders like Pierre Nkurunziza and John Magufuli and others, you know, and impress upon them the importance of media freedom. You know, we've done that with past presidents in South Africa, from President Mandela, President Thabo Mbeki, President Zuma, and we'll do so with President Ramaphosa. But the responsibility, I think, doesn't also end with politicians. I think the media fraternity throughout the continent, starting with our media here, we've got to give voices to the voiceless. You know, the story that you are referring to now, where was it in our media?
Yes.
Where was the murder in broad daylight of the Nigerian journalist?
What does it then tell you about the industry and how the industry treats stories of journalists? Because I know, for instance, in many newsrooms that I've worked in and many protests that I've covered, we've always been told that the journalist can never become the story, and that somehow would give you a different perspective of exactly what is happening, because there's one version of the story that's being silenced, because in the newsrooms you are told that you do not cover yourself.
Well, journalism is a human right, and when somebody else's human right is violated, that is a story, you know. And I think the kind of solidarity that the media can give to each other is to create awareness around media freedom, because media freedom is not for you and I. You know, media freedom is for ordinary people who have a right to get information that is uncensored, uncolored, so that they can make decisions about their own lives. You know, so it is important for the media in South Africa and everywhere else to give awareness to these incidents, because what the dictators want is that the 4 journalists in Burundi get detained, the 7...
It becomes a scare tactic.
Yes, and nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
You know, so if nobody talks about it, they can do whatever they want to do in secrecy, you know.
And on the end of the police, do you think there's anything from a law enforcement side that could be done?
Well, you know, the most important thing that TIFE continues to do, one is to fight to have all the legislation that is anti-media freedom removed from statute books across the continent. The second is to capacity building, the capacity building program that we've embarked on to make our national and regional bodies strong. And because strong national bodies and regional bodies will know what their rights are. They will empower their journalists. They will teach them how to behave when they are faced with police.
Just quickly, Jovial, the reason that I'm asking about about law enforcement is because law enforcement themselves are then used by politicians to carry out these attacks on journalists.
Well, the law enforcement agencies are there to enforce the Constitution, not the whims of any politician. This is why, for us, what is important is to have those laws that are anti-media freedom removed from the statute books, because it is only when that happens that we can then hold the police accountable and say, what is it that you're doing? You know, we have similar cases here where sometimes the South African police don't seem to understand Section 16 of our Constitution. And we take that on because our Constitution empowers us to do so. So if we get the Constitution in Burundi, in Uganda and other places changed and all these laws that are inimical removed, that will empower us to do our work much easier.
Thank you so much for your time, Jovial Rantau, who's the chairperson of the African Editors Forum.